All right, we are Bereans at the Gate. This is our video blog for October 29th, 2018. Welcome back to our viewers and our listeners. Gentlemen, I hope you all have been doing well over the past week. We are collected once again, and we are still in the midst of interesting political times. Last week we've had mail bombs, or at least things that looked like mail bombs that were sent through the mail, at least to 14 different people from what I've heard. We had a gentleman go into a synagogue recently and shoot it up, kill 11 people last number I got, in the name of his hatred of Jews. We seem to be in an era where we've had a little bit of a percolation in political violence, I suppose is the best way to put it. So first, let's put this in some historical context. I mean, how violent is this? Is this something that we should be worried about as a society? Or is this, I hate to say normal, but is this sort of more into the norm? I mean, Mark, let's ask our resident historian.
Well, I'm not sure I see this particular kind of violence as the same as the political violence, say, in the 60s that we saw, the rioting and the Vietnam War protests and so forth. There generally wasn't the same level of violence. People weren't going around shooting other people up and sending a lot of bombs. There were some bombs.
Yeah, there were.
SDS, for example, Students for a Democratic Society.
Right.
They did actually attempt some bombings. They weren't very successful with that.
And the Weather Underground.
Weather Underground, yeah, split from the New Left.
Right.
They did do some of that, but it has the feel that there's more and a more escalated sense of it now. For example, like this guy who shoots people in the Jewish synagogue. I didn't see that. You don't see that in the 60s.
Right.
Shooting up people because of their particular religious beliefs. So
we did see political assassinations.
We did see a couple,
which is something
few of
obviously
those.
that's missing right now, thankfully.
Thankfully, that's missing. And maybe because they're better protected now. People who are important are better protected.
So you said it feels different. Does it feel different because of media coverage, because of social media? I mean, why do you think it might feel more pressing now than it even did then for people?
That's a good question. It is more publicized.
Right.
The media is there.
Right.
Lots of media.
We got
Every
video
time it
of
happens.
everything.
Yes.
Right.
All the time, wall to wall. But it also just seems like there's a variety of violence now that there wasn't then. It was centered on a particular cause, at least then. And now you wonder what are the causes out there? There are all sorts of different causes that at least are put forth as causes.
Right.
Whether they are always the cause, they could be just people who have been incited in some way by that, but are really mentally unstable.
Yeah, I was going to make that point. I mean, to what degree are these really political acts? I mean, you expect to see some sort of a coherent ideology behind it, some sort of connection between the target and the ideology, and some kind of statement that's being made. I suppose in the Jewish synagogue, you could argue there's an element there. A lot of the violence we've seen looks more random and unstable in some ways. I don't know. Of course, people would look at it and say, well, you guys are just making excuses for pro-Trump people or whatever. That fellow seems pretty unhinged from what I can tell.
He did.
I don't think the individual in the Jewish synagogue was necessarily pro-Trump.
No, I mean the mail bomb guy. And he's definitely more.
Let me mention one other difference between what's happening today and I think what happened in the days of the 60s.
Right.
When I think of the 60s, the radicals were fringe. There were just a few of them. They may have been very active for their numbers, but it was a small percentage. I mean, you think about we talk about 1968 now and reminisce on it in some ways, but it was not a large group of people. Most of the folks in the country were still very much part of a larger culture. And now I just think we're more bifurcated. We may be a little bit more active politically, and I think some of that has to do with social media, that we're more connected and we hear things, we don't analyze, but we're not as disciplined as a people. And we had, it was like we were watching what was going on in Chicago and in California, somewhat from a distance. And it may seem like there was a lot happening, but again, I just don't think it was as pervasive across our culture.
Yeah.
And perhaps today it's not either, but I think we're a little bit more in tune today just because we're more connected.
So you think that the polarization may be worse now in terms of there's two split camps
Or many
that
split
are
camps.
more clearly divided and there's not as many people in between?
I think so. I think we were much more centrist in the days of the 60s
Right.
throughout the 70s.
Right.
And also people just simply were not quite as engaged. They were more engaged with simply living their lives and trying to make it. One of the points that we have going on now is with our economic success, we have time and ability to invest. And in the 60s, a lot of people were much more concerned with simply making it
Right.
and pushing up a standard of living to where they would have could have comfort.
Right.
And today, it's almost given to so many people.
Right.
It just comes as part of the package of being an American, which allows us to have more discretionary time, and a lot of it is spent, I think, on.
So you're saying their energies were funneled into making a living in the 60s, whereas now they may still have the same kind of mentality.
But I also think we had
now
more
they
of
just
of
have-
a cohesion of being an American and liking being an American. There was a theme there,
Yeah,
a
that's
civil
true. I think that's
religion
true.
that encompassed a large swath of the country. And I'm not sure if that's as strong now. I just think it's more bifurcated.
Civil religion
Yeah.
is fragmented, I think.
Jeff, what do you think?
I would just pick up on what Dr. Wheeler said. I mean, it seems pretty clear to me that kind of that central fabric of the nation. We always hear recently, certainly in Christian circles, about the decline of cultural Christianity. And clearly that cultural Christianity has declined. I think that this is in part a reflection. I don't think he would ever take the case of some of these
Sure, right,
unhinged
right,
people
yeah,
that do these things.
Yeah.
But in terms of the wider spread antagonism, the kind of public discourse that we've been talking about, seems to me that that's part of a reflection of this. I think another aspect of this in the broader sense, rather than the specifics of these particular cases, unfortunately, that we've just seen, is the idea of identity politics. What we saw for a long time was identity politics was something played by mainly the left, and it was not even the complete left. Well, that seems to have totally subsumed the progressive left, and it's also now come into the right, which is where we're different. So now everybody's this own industry group, and I think that's what gets to what you're talking about. We don't have that central kind of American theme, and you don't have that central morality that was there.
Don't
Now
have
we're
that.
just our own groups, and I think that leads to a lot of the strife that we see.
A lot of the friction grows because of that.
Cuts along different lines, yeah.
I guess the question that maybe our listeners and viewers are interested in, who's at fault here? I mean, the very common narrative that we're hearing is President Trump is at fault here because he's created a culture that maybe is more prone to thinking this way. Maybe his campaign rallies and even the style of his presidency is more pointed, a little bit more combative. Can we say that he's reasonably responsible for some of these things? Not responsible at all? Obviously, is it somewhere in the middle? What do you think, Bert?
Well, I think to say that there would be no responsibility would be irresponsible on our behalf.
Yeah.
I think there has to be some culpability there, but I also think that the way that President Trump acts and behaves is more of a result than a cause. He's just part of this overall mixture, tumbleweed that we have going on in our country, where we blow from idea to idea from day to day. The news cycle is so quick. I think he's just part of that. With that said, rhetoric is incredibly important. What we say over time is important. Him continually tweeting, and I think he has cleaned up a little bit, but it's still not quite what we would want, I think. And I think you have to think he's part of it, but not in a way that you could directly connect in a court of law. It's not like you can say
Sure,
that
yeah.
what he did caused the
Proximate cause.
pipe bomber to do what he did. I don't think that would even be correct, and you couldn't
Right.
prove it. But I think in the overall milieu of our nation, having a president that behaves the way President Trump does definitely affects individuals' behavior. And to say that there's no effect would be wrong, but to also to say that, yes, he caused this, I think would be simplistic and short-sighted.
Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree partly with Bert, but there could be other causal factors too, and we don't actually know at this point. We can't actually know, we can speculate a bit. And I do tend to agree that he plays a role. But on the other hand, as he himself would say, or we should ask the question anyway, does the news media play a role too? Is that possible?
Sure.
And does the general decline in cultural Christianity, in ethics in general, play a role too? Do all those things together play a role? So that now, when an individual who's a little bit on the edge comes along, he's easily pushed, very easily pushed. Right? Just a little push and he's gone. He's over the edge.
I would not disagree with that. All I was saying is to say that Trump played zero role, I think is wrong.
Probably.
I think he plays some role.
Probably,
If
yeah.
you were to go at it in percentages, I imagine it would be a relatively small
Right.
percentage if you could somehow parse it out that way.
Yeah.
But I do think that in the longer term, in ways that we can't map directly, it'll do more damage long term, just simply to our culture,
Yeah.
by having this particular gentleman as our president. So
Yeah.
and I think he's connected here in some very hard to define manner, is all I was saying. I agree there's a bunch of things.
Sure.
I mean, is the media more responsible? Again, I don't know, maybe.
We just don't know, yeah.
Right.
I would tend to think that the reality that we've got going on here is that in a nation that's historically Christian, that the church becoming less and less important is more culpable than any of the things that we've mentioned here.
Yeah.
I mean,
But
it's a foundation of our morality and our behavior.
Yeah.
And I don't want to discount that, but we're looking at a decline in civil society,
Yeah,
right? You're
that's-
looking at
that's where you're going.
organizations, these sort of mediating institutions that exist in society between the individual and government, they're shrinking. You
Yeah.
know, clubs, issue
Sure.
networks, whatever you want to talk about. And you know, we used to exist in these sort of webs of influence that were around us that would curtail some of this thing. Your
What I was-
family, your community, they'd come alongside and say, you know,
Yeah.
this guy's a little
So I
funny
agree
these
with
days,
you
maybe we should
completely.
get around
What I'm
them.
saying
Yeah.
is that at a foundational level, I agree
Sure.
completely with what you're
Yeah.
saying, but those mediating institutions are built upon individuals who are being conformed into the image of Christ and or at least lived in a Christian culture enough to where they had to fake it to get by. And I
Yeah.
think that's what's missing
Yeah.
right now. So therefore the institutions crumble or are no longer
Right,
effective.
right, yeah, I don't disagree with that. Jeff, what do you think?
I think that there's another
Multifaceted.
factor that plays in this. I don't disagree with anything I've heard so far. But as we've seen the general cultural decline downward, we also need to kind of understand we've had a ratcheting up of the impact of government in our lives, such that government and the control of it is now much more fundamentally important. So if we think about this in the big scheme of things, there's always been people in our country, and there's always been your neighbors that you may have trouble getting along with. But we express tolerance for one another, mostly because we say, let me live my life alone, and I'll let you leave your, I don't like you, but I'll just keep to myself and so forth. And that's just generally the way America has worked. But now we have a situation where so much of what we want is a direct impact on somebody else's political goals, and so we're not willing to have tolerance for ourselves. So for instance, you go back to the cake and the baker, right?
Yeah, right,
You know,
right.
so now if you disagree with somebody's political perspective and theological perspective, now we're going to put you out of business and destroy your livelihood. You have just ratcheted up the impact of political disagreement, and it goes both ways.
carry it
But
one
the
step further.
stakes are way higher in an era where government has increased in its scope and impact into our lives. And I don't further, this is my negativity here. I see no improvement there because one side is their whole goal is to further even increase the level of that political intersection with our lives. There's very left for civil. We talk about the collapse of civil.
Yeah.
Well, the collapse of civil is in large part because it has been shrunk deliberately. And
Yeah.
so I'm concerned about that.
That was one
Politics.
of my next question. We can blame President Trump to a degree. I mean, like you said, maybe a limited degree. Does the progressive left deserve some of the blame as well? I mean, you've said their goal in creating a state that is more responsible for more of our lives. I agree with you there. What about in their rhetoric? I mean, are we?
Well,
would we
let's
say that
go
they're
back.
part of this
I mean,
rhetorical issue?
Clearly they are. So Maxine Waters is a firebrand. But let's face it, we had Ron Dellums as a firebrand, and there are many other firebrands in Democratic past. But they weren't given the public airplay, so that plays into your media comment.
Right.
But also because of the extent where they have political power.
Right.
Where before they were marginalized. Now, I mean, if the Democrats take over, isn't she a committee chairman? And I think she is. And that's a scary thought.
But let me try to generalize this. As if you talk about the progressive left, as politics becomes more important, which it
Yeah.
is for them,
Right.
politics in itself sort of swallows up the rest of life.
Yeah.
Then you
That's
make
the
everything political
Yeah.
in some sense. And it's very easy to push people in the wrong directions in that way. Just like we've always had violence in certain situations that could get other people pulled into it.
Sure.
It's easy to get one individual pulled into it.
See,
And so how do you fight that as conservatives,
Yeah.
but still maintain the proper perspective on politics? That's-
Well,
Very
I
difficult.
Play the game
think that
too.
you've got the only solution for us, which is antithetical to the other side's position, is to shrink the government
Right,
influence.
right.
But that's
At the
what
same
we're-
time you do
yeah,
that, though,
yeah.
increase the influence that we had from religion, from civil society, those kinds of things. You can't
I
just
think
do the
you'll have
negative.
to
you
have the
both.
positive side of increasing something before you take something
Yeah,
away. I just
yeah.
do not think that we can. And well, let's look at our culture a different way. We're in some ways picturing it as them and us, and we use that
Sure.
those pronouns. Look at the progressives as people that are just out. I don't want to say ahead, because that's not really correct. But in any group of people, you do have those that seek change more than those that
Yep.
that are kind of look backwards. And you know, in a sense, the conservatives are kind of act like the progressives after a particular passage of time, and the
Yep.
progressives go on and do something else, and then we just kind of catch up or lag behind, depending upon how you look at it.
We can be just as activists, in other words.
Yeah. So I think what we really need is a positive program to move forward. And I think, again, it's the basic classical liberalism that I think we've turned our back on. And that's really what I think, in my opinion, is all we can do.
possible.
Now, we always, when we used to speak occasionally in chapel, we would always, it seems to me, like finish up by saying that we need revival. And we need that. And ultimately, that is what we need, because it is the individual people making the choices, and they have to have a moral foundation to be able to do it. But I don't know if just trying to fight the battle in the arena of size of government influence is going to do it. There needs to be more in there.
Need
And
more.
I know, Jeff, you're not saying
That's
that we
one
don't
aspect.
need more, but
Yeah.
yeah.
All right, well, I think we're out of time. I appreciate all of our listeners and all of our viewers, and we'll see you next week.